Okay, in the last video we examined the adaptation account of innateness, and that view faces some quite serious problems, but it does seem to rest on some pretty plausible ideas. And in particular, I think the intuition of the adaptation account is that innateness is, it's in some sense about what the environment does not contribute to development, and then the isolation experiments and poverty of the stimulus arguments allow us to identify traits that develop in a wide range of environments, right? Even environments that are in some sense impoverished. And so innate traits are the heritage of the species. They appear in all sorts of different environments. Now there's another view that can also appeal to isolation experiments in this kind of way, and this is the canalization account, which has been defended most prominently by André Ariew. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name correctly there, but never mind. So canalization is a technical concept in biology, which I'll explain in a moment, but the basic idea of this account is that innate traits are those whose development is relatively insensitive to variations in the environment. Some traits are environmentally sensitive. They require a specific set of environmental resources in order to emerge. Other traits will develop in basically the same way in a large range of environmental conditions. And this is innateness, right? It's these traits that are relatively insensitive to environmental variation. Now, a trait that develops in a wide range of environments is said to be environmentally canalized. Canalization is an idea that was developed by C.H. Waddington, who describes it as, and I quote, the capacity to produce a particular definite end result in spite of a certain variability both in the initial situation from which development starts and in the conditions met during its course. So to give a bit more background, Waddington held that all genes plus parts of the environment form a unified developmental system. And the growth of the organism has to be understood as arising from this developmental system as a whole, right? So we shouldn't treat an organism as a mere collection of genes, like, you get a bunch of genes and put them in a bag or whatever, right? No, it's a kind of unified whole system. And in particular, Waddington was struck by how this system is robust to variation in genes or environment. Populations of organisms within a particular species will exhibit a remarkable amount of phenotypic uniformity. They will have, they will look the same, they'll have the same kinds of behaviors and so on. And that's despite very often major genetic and environmental variation. So with respect to genes, the genome is constantly being reorganized during reproduction when the genomes of the parents are cut up and recombined. Furthermore, mutation is constantly altering genes. So genetic variation is widespread. And then with respect to the environment, well, of course, people are raised in very different environments. And yet the morphology of most organisms is remarkably similar. So we have to understand this in terms of higher level dynamical properties of the developmental system. I mean, of course, there are differences. Humans have different skin colors and different blood types, etc. And there are sometimes, I guess, significant mutations, but in general, all humans have basically the same kind of form, So we have to think of this in terms of the properties of the developmental system as a whole. Maybe a good analogy here would be to consider a process like Jupiter's Great Red Spot. So there's that enormous storm on Jupiter that's existed for at least hundreds of years now. Obviously, there's constant variation within the spot. There are changes in the wind speed, the pressure, the placing of the constituent molecules. Right, that's always changing. If you think about it in terms of the molecules, if you were to like zoom in on the spot and experience it close up, it would just be total chaos, constantly changing. And yet, this overall higher level structure remains. So similarly, when you look at a species, well, the genes and environments are constantly being mixed up, and yet the organisms being produced always have this very similar form. Waddington developed a useful model of the developmental landscape shown in this image. So on the left we have a surface representing different states of the phenotype of the organism. and a ball rolling down the surface represents the development of the organism. So the idea is that as the ball rolls down, as it goes to sort of different places on this landscape, the organism's features change. The ball goes into different places, and those different places represent different phenotypes. As you develop as a person, you're constantly changing, your height is growing, muscles developing, all of that. That's the idea. As this ball rolls down, that represents those changes. On the right, we're looking at the same surface from below. And we see that the shape of this surface is created by various pegs. These pegs can be taken to represent genetic and environmental influences. And you can add pegs, you can remove pegs, you can change their interactions to change the state of the surface. Now, the point is that some changes will alter the surface significantly. Some changes in the pegs will have a dramatic effect on the path of the ball. Other changes may have little or no effect, and still other changes may have a significant detectable effect, but the ball might end up in the same place in the end regardless. Right? Maybe the ball would go down like a different pathway, but then it would go to the same end state. Obviously, the effect on the surface of changing the pegs below depends on the overall structure of the system. So it's this whole system of interacting influences that we have to think about. And you could probably, the idea for Waddington is in some cases you could change a lot of these pegs, but the surface could still have basically the same form. And this can this sort of thinking this way allows us to define two types of canalization. So in genetic canalization, the development of a trait is insensitive to manipulating the genetic parameters. The idea is that you can change the genetic pegs, as it were, substantially, and the ball still rolls to the same place. Right? You change the genes substantially, but you still get the same trait emerging. In environmental canalization, development of a trait is insensitive to manipulating the environmental parameters. So you change the environmental pegs substantially, again the ball still rolls to the same place. The same trait emerges. Like with something like eye colour, say. Okay, very, very different environments. Whether I could have been brought up here in the UK, I could have been brought up in, I don't know, among the Inuit, in the Arctic, right? Very different environments, I'd still have the same eye colour. So anyway, according to Ariew, innateness is environmental canalization. A trait is innate, just in case its development is insensitive to environmental variation. Recall the isolation experiments that we talked about in the last video. On Ariew's view, these are important for establishing innateness, but the point here isn't so much the isolation, it's the radical change in the environment. If rats brought up in a depleted laboratory environment without social contact develop the same trait as rats brought up in the wild, well, that trait must appear across a wide range of environments. Development of the trait is environmentally canalized. Just as a, I guess, terminological point, for the rest of this video, I'll just use the word canalization to refer specifically to environmental canalization. So we can kind of put genetic canalization to one side. Okay, well, obviously canalization is a matter of degree. No trait could be completely insensitive to environmental variation. An embryo could not develop in a vacuum, for example. But the more experiments you do with different environments while the trait still develops, the greater the degree of environmental canalization that you have shown. The key to innateness then is that only very severe environmental perturbations can force the course of development off its normal path. It's important to note that a trait which is very environmentally sensitive and so is not canalized might still be universal, because perhaps the environment is very stable with respect to the relevant resources involved in the development of the trait, or perhaps the organism constructs its environment to ensure the presence of the resources. I mean, this is most obvious with humans. All educated humans believe that the Earth orbits the Sun. I mean, that belief is pretty much universal among humanity now, right? The belief that the Earth orbits the Sun. Now, obviously this belief is not in any sense innate, and nor is it's not canalized, right? It's just that we've structured the developmental environment in a very precise way. so that all civilized societies now share that particular structure. We bring people up to inculcate them with that belief. So when we ask whether a trait is sensitive to environmental variability, we have to bear in mind that the relevant variability might not actually obtain. Universality is a good indication of canalization, but it's not conclusive. I guess another point that's worth sort of keeping in mind here is, obviously all humans do live in very different environments. As I say, I live in the UK. If you were to go to a place in Africa, say, it's a very different environment. Go to a place in the Arctic, that's a very different environment. But so although those environments are very different, I think the idea is that with respect to the trait of believing that the Earth orbits the Sun, the developmental resources kind of pushing us towards having that trait are the same, or at least very similar in these different environments. We specifically give people the same education in that respect. So you kind of have to think about not just environment in general, but the environmental resources that are relevant to the trait. Anyway, Ariew defends the canalization account by suggesting that our account of innateness must meet 3 criteria. First, innateness must be a feature of the development of the individual. Right? It concerns how individuals acquire their traits. So innateness must be about the developmental requirements. We saw that this was a problem with defining innateness in terms of concepts like heritability. Heritability is defined relative to a population, so that the heritability of one of your traits changes depending on what population we assume that you're in. Innateness should be, I guess, intrinsic to the organism. It should not be population dependent. And the canalization account meets this criterion. Whether or not, or at least Ariew suggests it does, although we will see later that there might be a problem here. But the idea is that whether or not development of one of your traits is sensitive to the environment, well, that does not depend on how other members of your population develop. Okay, second, he says that innate traits must be environmentally stable. They must not depend on specific environmental resources. When we say that a trait is innate, we mean that it is in some sense within the organism, caused by the organism rather than by the environment. And, well, I mean, obviously the canalization account meets this criterion. Finally, Ariew says we should be able to appeal to natural selection to explain innateness. So what the adaptation account gets right is that there is an important connection between innateness and selection. This is that the fact that a trait was selected for explains why it's innate. Selection is one of the processes that can cause innateness. I guess another way to state this criterion is that our definition of innateness must make it clear how innateness fits into the rest of biological theory and fits with other biological explanations. And I mean, obviously, evolutionary theory is central to biology. We often think of biology through the lens of natural selection and evolution. So we need to be able to understand, you know, how innateness fits in with this wider biological theory. And the idea is that the canalization account meets this criterion as well, because natural selection is one of the processes that can cause traits to become canalized. As an example of this, Waddington performed experiments on Drosophila flies, and he found that when those flies were exposed to ether vapor, some of the embryos developed a second thorax, which is a very radical mutation in the bodily structure. Now, initially, the bithorax condition was not innate because it only appeared due to a specialized environmental condition, the high exposure to ether vapor. But Waddington continually selected for flies raised in ether vapor, and after 20 or so generations, flies could be produced that developed the bithorax condition without exposure to the ether. So you raise flies in exposure to ether vapor for 20 generations, and then you get some flies and don't expose them to ether vapor. When they reproduce, flies will be born that have this bithorax without the exposure to the ether. So the bithorax trait had become canalized. It appeared under a variety of different environmental conditions. and so selection made the trait innate. In general, I guess canalized traits are likely those that have been important to the organism's survival and reproduction. You know, if a trait is insensitive to environmental variation, that's probably because, not always, but probably because there was selection pressure leading it to become insensitive to environmental change. Now, having said this, the canalization account is clearly distinguished from the adaptation account because traits can become canalized in other ways. Huntington's disease is a good example. Huntington's disease is obviously not an adaptation, but it is strongly canalized. If you have the Huntington's gene, you will develop the disease in many environments. It makes no difference if you change your diet, change the climate, change the kind of people you associate with, change the conditions of your upbringing, etc. If you have the Huntington gene, then almost all paths on the developmental landscape will lead the ball to the disease. So, does this work as a definition of innateness? Well, canalization is certainly a perfectly respectable biological concept, but I think when we consider the technical details a little bit further, we do perhaps run into some problems if we take this as a definition of innateness. The first point is that, strictly speaking, we shouldn't really say without qualification, or at least it would be perhaps unusual to say without qualification, that some trait T is environmentally canalized. Rather, the claim would be that if the development of T is insensitive to variation in environmental factor E, then T is environmentally canalized with respect to E. And of course, similarly, with genetic canalization, if development of T is insensitive to variation in genetic factor G, T is genetically canalized with respect to G. So the point here is we specify a particular environment or set of environments and show that the development of T is insensitive to certain specified changes. Biologists should precisely specify the environment and the changes to that environment, right? Good science is generally concerned with precision and quantification. We want to know exactly what environments can this trait develop in. And actually, one reason why we need more specificity here is that we want to focus on variation that is relevant, right? Environmental variation is relevant. So I mentioned earlier, humans believing that the Earth orbits the Sun. Well, we don't want to say that this is canalized, but actually it does appear in many different environments. As I mentioned, it appears among the Inuits, among people in near the equator in Africa. It appears among people who live in Brazil, near rainforests, etc. These are very different environments. But the point is that there are certain specific environmental resources that are required for that trait to emerge, and those environmental resources obtain in all of these seemingly different environments. So in general then, we're going to want to be specific. But what Ariew wants to do is go further than this. He wants to talk about environmental canalization in general, right? The degree of environmental canalization in general. But all traits, the development of all traits is sensitive to some types of environmental variation and insensitive to others. So it's not entirely obvious what it means to say that some trait is environmentally canalized in general. One obvious option is to say, well, let's just look at actual environments, right? So for some species and some trait, let's look at the environments that members of the species have actually developed in. And so on this approach, X, some trait X, or T rather, is environmentally canalized just in case it's universal or near universal through the whole spatiotemporal distribution of the species. If there are some environments where members of the species don't develop the trait, then it's not canalized. But on this approach, the canalization account is often simply inapplicable because there might not be any relevant environmental variation. This is especially obvious with newly emerging species that have very limited ranges, such as island species. Imagine a population of birds gets isolated on an island and it undergoes rapid evolution, becoming a new species. Every member of this species occupies a very similar environment. Right, there are many traits that would count as canalized just because the environmental variation is so limited and always has been so limited because it's a new species, right? This species has only just emerged and it's always been limited to this single island environment. And an important point to notice here is that actually canalization ends up looking a bit like heritability. So recall that with heritability, if there is no environmental variation, then the heritability of every trait is 1. Well, on this way of thinking about canalization, then every trait will come out canalized if there is no environmental variation. So then judgments of innateness end up depending on the nature of the rest of your population, which is something that we wanted to avoid. I mean, one of the benefits of the canalization account, according to Ariew, is that it avoids that problem. But if we think of canalization in terms of the actual environments that the species is found in, then it looks like that problem re-arises. So I mean, one option then might be to say, well, we should consider all possible environments. We could say that traits which develop in the largest number of all possible environments are canalized. Clearly, it would be impossible to empirically quantify the degree of canalization in this case. We simply don't have enough evidence. I mean, actually, it's not clear what would even count as evidence. And of course, if we're talking about all possible environments, then all traits would only appear in a minuscule fraction. So just consider deep space or the surface of the sun, the interior of the earth. The vast majority of environments are simply inhospitable, so the trait wouldn't develop at all. A better option might be, well, let's say we take all possible environments that the organism could, at least in principle, survive in. We take the set of environments in which the organism could survive, and if a trait turns up in many of those environments, it's canalized and so innate. If it turns up in very few, it's not canalized. Again, it looks like there's not really any way to empirically measure this. I mean, the best we can do in practice is show that some particular environmental factor does not influence the trait. But we can't infer from this that development is insensitive to environmental variation in general, where we're quantifying over all possible environments that the organism could, in principle, survive in. I mean, there are all kinds of bizarre environments that an organism could grow up in. Imagine if humans were to build a huge habitable spaceship and live on it for generations. How could we know precisely how particular traits would develop in that kind of environment? I mean, it's not clear how evidence could bear on this. And furthermore, I mean, why should biologists care about such environments? Why does it matter how a trait would develop in some science fiction scenario? I mean, I guess the worry here is that on this way of thinking about canalization, it becomes something that's quite speculative and untethered from empirical work, and it's not really obvious what the biological significance of it is. Innateness is supposed to be a significant and biologically interesting property, but if we define innateness as canalization in this sense, then again, it's not clear what work innateness is doing, I guess. So there are some problems with defining canalization and defining what it means for a trait to be insensitive to environmental variation. I mean, I think it's one of those concepts that sort of intuitively seems to make sense, but then it's not entirely obvious how we define it precisely. Okay, another problem for canalization, the canalization account, arises with traits that are adaptations but are not canalized. These traits are adapted only to a very specific range of environments. An example given by Griffiths and Macquarie in their article Innateness, Canalization and Biologicizing the Mind comes from studies on rats. The spinal cord nuclei of male and female rats differs in ways that allow the male rats to use their penises during sex. And the differences in the spinal cord nuclei are caused by differences in the gene expression in the spinal cords of the male and female rats. These differences in gene expression are caused by the licking of the genital area by the male rat's mother. So male rats produce a chemical that causes the mother to lick their genitals, and this leads to changes in the spinal cord, and these changes ultimately help the adult male rat to copulate, right? So is that clear? You have the male rats produce this chemical. The chemical causes the mother to lick their genitals. This licking of the genitals by the mother causes changes in the male rat's spinal cord, and it's these changes in the spinal cord that allow the adult male rat to have sex. So it seems that on the canalization account, the male rat's ability to copulate is not innate, because it's dependent on a very specific environmental influence, which is licking of the genital area by the mother. If you remove that environmental input, the trait won't develop. But it seems very strange, right? Because surely it is innate. I mean, I think we have a very strong intuition that this would be innate. Male rats are adapted to respond to licking by the mother. The mothers are adapted to lick the male offspring in response to the chemical that they produce. And in practice, almost all male rats are exposed to this particular environmental influence. And this is a result of their evolutionary history. This is a result of natural selection. It's like natural selection has built rats for this to occur. And this kind of thing, I think, will probably happen quite often. So we'll probably find a similar kind of thing in the case of species that have just recently developed. So like a population of birds being cut off on an island. Suppose that there are birds that migrate to an island and then they develop an adaptation to behave in a certain way when encountering nuts that are native to the island, right? That behavior, the way that they behave, may not be canalized because it only happens in response to a specific environmental influence. But it seems that it would still be innate because it's universal within that population and because it's an adaptation. Now, as we saw with Waddington's study of flies, adaptation and natural selection often leads to canalization, but it doesn't necessarily do so. And sometimes you can have adaptations that are not canalized. A similar point is that organisms construct their environments. This is something known as niche construction. Organisms will alter their environment in such a way that the environment better supports the survival of the organism. Think about beaver dams, termite mounds, earthworms changing the composition of the soil. If we think about innateness if we think about innate traits as those traits that are insensitive to environmental variation, I mean, I guess there's a worry that this is misleading about the relation between the animals and environment. So earthworms are adapted to a very specific environment, a very specific kind of soil environment that was constructed by the behavior of their ancestors. And modern earthworms help to maintain this environmental condition. They help to maintain the environmental conditions in which they best develop. And so I guess the question is, what does it matter, right, if certain traits are dependent on this fairly specific environment? The worry here is that viewing innate traits as those that are insensitive to environmental variation ends up obscuring the ways that organisms are sometimes selected so as to maintain very specific environmental resources. And we would probably want to think of this in terms of innateness as well. Griffiths and Macquarie proposed that if a trait is an adaptation and it's universal in the species, then it will be considered innate regardless of whether it's environmentally canalized. Of course, we've already seen that there are problems with the adaptation account, and in fact Griffiths and Macquarie don't accept the adaptation account. Their point is just that there are many cases that are going to be counterintuitive for the canalization account also. And so I suppose, thinking about this rat example, say, I mean, just why exactly shouldn't that trait be considered innate, right? The male rat's ability to copulate. Why? I mean, we would intuitively think that the ability to copulate is innate, right? So it turns out that it's dependent on a specific type of environmental input. Why does that mean that it's not innate? I mean, what is so special, I guess, about emerging in a wide range of environments? I mean, it's not obvious what the motivation for the canalization account is, right, beyond the fact that it solves some problems that plague other accounts, or so Griffiths and Macquarie suggest. So those were some issues with the canalization account, and that's all for now. Thank you for watching.